Alright guys, welcome to section 2 of our class about human rights. And we're going to start this section by talking a little bit about the history of human rights thought and human rights beliefs. Once again, I want to point out that this is very Western focused, but that's kind of a unfortunately necessary result of the academic focus on Western thought about um, human rights and individualism and liberty and all those things. So I acknowledge and apologize that this is so Western focused. But in the Western tradition, we can go all the way back to, BC, right? We can go back to Plato, right? There was that succession of three really, really famous philosophers way back in ancient Greece. Like there was Socrates, and then he taught Plato, and then Plato taught Aristotle. And it was those three really set a huge foundation for philosophy and human rights and all those things way back hundreds of years BC. And one of the things Plato pointed out was that, look, everybody deserves fair treatment. Doesn't matter whether you're a citizen, a slave, a foreigner, whatever. Every person, because they're a person, deserves fair treatment. Okay? And that was kind of a radical thought at the time, because back then, you were Greek or you were a foreigner. You were this weird other person, or you were a slave and had very few rights. Along comes a guy named Cicero. Cicero first points out that look, everybody's a citizen of the world, right? We all live on this planet. We're all citizens of that world. So we need to look at ourselves as kind of one people. And there's this universal law, this, treat people with respect. People deserve rights. People deserve the right to life. People deserve, to be treated fairly. That supersedes any written law. So this is the first inkling in Western thought of a concept we're going to talk a lot more about later on, about how there's this universal law, this law of nature that supersedes any kind of human written law, and is more important than any human written law. The Bible. The Bible actually has a lot of stuff in there about rights, right? I mean, a couple of the more famous passages are "Thou shalt not steal" and "Thou shalt not kill," right? Direct from the Ten Commandments. And those, while it doesn't outright say it, they certainly heavily implies, "Thou shalt not steal" heavily implies a right to property. You have the right to own property, and you have the right to have that property not be taken from you, right? I mean, that's kind of what "thou shalt not steal" means, is that you shall not violate someone else's right to own property. "Thou shalt not kill" implies that people have a right to life. You don't have the right to take away that right to life, right? That is a violation of their innate worthiness as a human. That's human rights. Fast forward many hundreds of years, St. Thomas Aquinas, he was a very famous, I don't know if he was a monk or a preacher, whatever, but he became a Catholic saint, and he did a lot of research and philosophy about humans and humanity and the nature of God and all these things. And he kind of came down on the side that dignity and value are innate in humanity, i.e., if you're a human, you deserve and have the right to dignity and value, to be treated with dignity, to be treated as if you have value just because you're a human. No other reason. Just those things are innate in every person. Okay? Hobbes, talked about him in section 1, right? He was the guy that said, look, humanity in its kind of natural basic state is in this constant state of warfare and conflict, right? We create the state, we create the government, we create the, whether it's a king, which, he was writing in 1651, so this was mostly, kings. we give this power to the king, and in the modern day we would say we give this power to our elected government, specifically so that we can surrender some of our freedoms, i.e. to steal from others, to kill others, to do all those things, in order to get security, i.e. people won't kill us or steal from us, right? But the important thing here is that Hobbes thought people were inherently violent, and we have to use the state to restrain those violent urges. Then along comes Locke, who again we talked about last time, and he says, no, look, the state of nature is peaceful, right? In our natural state, we're not at conflict. We're just trying to, interact with each other in a peaceful way, and we do these transactions, voluntary transactions, whether it's marriage, whether it's trading, chickens for wheat, whether it's, I'm going to live here and you're going to live over there. We make these independent voluntary transactions with each other. And it's not until those transactions are kind of violated, or one member of the transaction decides to not abide by the terms of the transaction, that problem is created. So we need the state as an independent, non-involved judge, as a non-involved rule maker, in order to make sure that those voluntary transactions are abided by both parties, right? And he's one of the first to say, look, we have these natural rights. Because we're people, we have these rights, not just to dignity and value, like Aquinas said. We have the right to life, liberty, and property. Those were Locke's big three rights. The right to life, the right to liberty, the right to property. I.e., nobody can kill us, or nobody should have the ability to kill us because we have this right to life. Nobody should have the ability to take away our choices, liberty, and nobody should have the right to take away our property, right? Those were his big three things. Roughly the same time, a few years later, we get Rousseau. Rousseau kind of expanded on Hobbes, and Rousseau talked more about that whole social contract thing, right? We get together and we give up our rights in order to gain the security from this governing body, whether it's a king or whatever. And again, back then they were still in the era of basically everybody in the Western world was ruled by a king. But Rousseau says, look, we need to have these communities where they represent the will of the people, not the will of the king, not the will of the nobles and the landed elite, but the will of the people. But in order to do that, we can't have big groups all trying to live together in one giant community. We need to have a bunch of separate small communities, and everybody in each of those small communities can do this kind of participatory democracy, i.e. we can get together and hash things out as a small group, rather than these, tens of thousands to millions of people that are in these giant countries. Montesquieu comes along and he says, look, there's kind of three areas of government. There's the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And those three functions need to be separate. They all need to be done by the government, but they need to be separated out and done in different ways by different people. Which, spoiler alert, the United States was one of the first to actually put that into practice. Voltaire comes along. Voltaire says, look, torture and degrading punishment are bad because these, working on these previous philosophers, he was saying people have this innate value. People have this dignity. We can't violate that through the use of torture and degrading punishment because those are never excusable. Those are just, they take away a person's innate value, and they have the absolute right to that innate value. He's also against censorship. He said, look, the only way we can have a good public understanding of different ideas is to talk about those ideas, to, allow books to be published even if you disagree with them. Allow pamphlets and newspapers to be published even if you don't like them. We need to be able to kind of see everything in order to understand the world and what we should do and shouldn't do. Then we get Kant. Kant, he comes up with a thing called kind of the categorical imperative. Okay, and there's a few different parts to that, but the important parts here for universal law, or for human rights, is A, we should always act as if the thing we do become a universal law, right? So whenever you're deciding an action, whether you should hit this person, whether you should take this thing, whether you should, do whatever, you need to imagine that whatever you're about to decide becomes a universal law. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Do you want, if I'm about to hit somebody because he, insulted my favorite football team, do you think everybody everywhere should be able to hit somebody else because they insult a football team? So you should always try to figure out, you should always do the action that you wish everybody else would do. Do the action that you wish became the norm, the law, the universal kind of standard for how to act in similar situations. Also, you need to treat people as ends, not means. So we've all heard that phrase, a means to an end. Means are essentially processes or ways of doing things. Ends are goals. They're the ultimate thing we want, right? The ends, I don't even know how to explain it any better than that. But we need to essentially treat people as ends in themselves, not means to an end, right? So in other words, I shouldn't use people to get what I want. I shouldn't kill people in order to gain money, right? Because people in themselves are these ends. They're not means to an end. They're not just some thing we can use. They're individuals. They are ends. But soon after Kant, we get revolutions, and not just in the United States. I mean, that's the one most of the people watching this are going to be familiar with, right? The United States Revolution, 1776, July 4th, go America. We rebel from the British. We end up ultimately winning the war and creating our own government. And a lot of the people who I've described up to this point influenced that government, especially with the separation of powers, natural rights, all those things really influenced our Constitution and how we've set up our country. There was also the French Revolution, which was roughly the same time. They overthrew their king, and there was a lot of post-revolutionary France government implementation with that were influenced by a lot of these same people. But revolution was kind of going around there for a while. Post-revolution United States, we got this guy Thomas Paine, and Thomas Paine was very much kind of a driver of the political thought of his day, which was post-revolution United States. He says, look, we need to have minimal state intervention in people's lives, but we need to, one of the things government should do is make sure that people are able to live their best lives. Make sure that they're able to at least have this minimum amount of opportunity, right? So he was a big fan of universal education, which we ended up adopting in this country, and social welfare, i.e. don't let people just, starve in the streets. We need to have this basic form of social welfare that allows people the opportunity to kind of realize their best selves. He was also a big fan of the formal implementation of rights, i.e. we need to write down at least some of these rights that people have. Like we all kind of agree, part of that whole American Revolution thing was we agree that people have these rights and the English government wasn't respecting our rights. So we need to kind of write down what those are. We need to describe what those rights are. And that became kind of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which is commonly called the Bill of Rights. Some people were against this because they thought that writing down certain rights would kind of lead people to assume that if it's not written down, then it doesn't exist as a right. And everybody says, look, we're not going to write down all the rights we have. So if we write down some of them, people are going to assume the others that we want to be rights and want to recognize as rights aren't. And that's why they put in the 9th Amendment, which basically says just that, right? Like, just because we didn't list it here doesn't mean it's not actually a right. Okay? Getting a little more modern history, we've got this lady, Wollstonecraft. I honestly don't know how to pronounce that name. But she was one of the first in modern Western philosophy to really talk about and be successful talking about the rights of women. Why are we treating women as these second-class citizens? They can't go to school, they can't own property, they can't, they have all these things taken away, all these choices taken away because they're still kind of this feeling that comes all the way back from the ancient world that daughters are the property of their fathers until they can be kind of sold off in marriage to a husband, at which point they become property of the husband. And Wollstonecraft was one of the first Western women to come out and in a very public way, very lots of people read her book kind of way, say, look, women are people too. We should have the right to an education so we can live our best lives. Like, Thomas Paine was talking about how people needed to have education so they could live their best lives. Women need that too. Women should have the opportunity to achieve self-actualization, i.e. achieve the goals and the life that they want for themselves. And one of the big things on that is education. But of course, it wasn't until really the late 20th century that women got even close to remote equal access to education, in the United States at least, and in most of the Western world. There's still places in the world where they don't have even close to equal access to education. But she was a very big driver of this kind of, look, women are people too. We need to, any human rights conversation has to apply to women the same way it does to men. Okay? There was this guy named Bentham. Bentham created or first came up with or described this thing called utilitarianism. And he's kind of he's going back to the subject of what is good and what is bad, right? What's the good decision to make? What's the bad decision to make? And utilitarianism, in a very, very basic way, says the right choice to make is that which brings the most good to the most people, right? So if I have to choose between something that will make one person mad but make 100 people happy, I should do it. If my choice is going to make me happy but 100 people mad, I should not do it, right? So it's that kind of balancing of make every choice that will bring the most good to the most people. But like previous philosophers we've talked about, he was big on this whole rational choice thing. People are going to weigh each decision they make looking at the positives and negatives and make a rational decision based on that decision-making process. Okay? He's also a big fan of positivism, which essentially means we need to study things with science. We can't just believe traditions. We can't believe, we have to measure things. We have to look at things kind of scientifically with math and numbers and statistics and all these things. And so he was a big fan of this positivist movement, this trying to investigate and discover and research instead of just looking at tradition and what our elders said and all those things. And then the last piece of history we're going to talk about is Arendt. And she was born in Germany and had to flee prior to World War II. She fled to France and then had to flee France and get to the United States. And that's where she lived the rest of her life, in the United States. And she talked a lot about a lot of this kind of human rights and good and evil and you know, all those kind of subjects we've been kind of touching on throughout this lecture. But one of the things that I want to point out with this particular philosopher is her focus on refugees and stateless people, because she was a refugee at one point, right? She had to flee Germany and flee France and come to the United States. And she talked a lot about kind of the right to citizenship. We have the right to have our rights understood and respected by a government, right? So it's not just that we have these rights that should be respected by government, but we have the right to have the right respected by government, right? And in kind of the modern world, according to her, what that means is citizenship. You have the right to be a citizen of something, because if you're not a citizen of anything, then kind of the way the world works in that real world way, we're not recognizing your human rights. And I pulled this quote directly from the book that I kind of based this entire lecture on, which is a very good book, by the way, Human Rights. We are not born equal. We become equal as members of a group on the strength of our decision to guarantee ourselves mutually equal rights. So it's not that these rights are coming down from our Creator. It's that the rights are coming from us as a human group, and we're deciding to recognize each other's rights so that other people will recognize our rights. But in order to be part of that group, you have to be a citizen of that group. So everybody has the right to be a citizen of something. Okay? All right, we'll be back next time with the second half of section 2.